Welcome back for part 2 of the AC hose repair. Alright, so now that we've replaced the receiver dryer, we are ready to vacuum down the system one more time. So I verify that the vacuum pump has adequate oil, make sure the manifold valves are closed, then turn on the vacuum pump. I then open both the low and high valves at the manifold and let the pump run for about 30 minutes. With the new receiver dryer in place, the vacuum pressure has gotten closer to 30 inches of mercury this time around, so we'll close the valves, then turn off the vacuum pump. We'll once again let the system sit for a while. I think I gave it about 30 minutes, then verified that no pressure was lost. We're now ready to charge the system with refrigerant. Since I don't have a scale to weigh the refrigerant and I don't know how much the system uses anyway, I decided to rely on a chart that uses the outside temperature and relative humidity to establish the correct low and high pressures. Once these pressures are reached, the system is effectively charged. The current temperature is 69 degrees with a relative humidity of 57%. So at almost 70 degrees, the chart specifies for both 50 and 60% humidity that the maximum low side pressure should read 30 psi and the maximum high side pressure should read 180 psi. The center vent air temp in the cabin should read about 48 degrees. First, I needed to disconnect the vacuum pump from the yellow charge line. I then poured a little UV dye for AC systems in the non-Schrader end of the yellow hose and connected it to the manifold. This was done to make it easier to detect a leak if one should ever occur later. As I mentioned previously, this truck's AC system uses R12 refrigerant, which is the older refrigerant that is no longer readily available. I happen to have a tank of R12 that I got very cheaply a few years ago. I made sure the valve on the tank was closed, removed the cap, then I connected the yellow hose to it. Next, I opened the tank's valve and purged air from the center line by depressing the Schrader valve at the manifold until a hint of refrigerant flowed out. To recharge the system, the truck needs to be running and the AC system needs to be turned on so the compressor can draw in the refrigerant. So I started the truck, flip the climate control switch to AC, then turn the fan to high. For some reason I couldn't find my stem thermometer to check the air temp at the center vent, so I used this infrared thermometer to read the vent hose temp and get some sort of indication as to whether the system was actually charging and functioning properly. The starting temp was 57 degrees. I then opened the low side valve. It's very important here that the high side valve remain closed throughout this procedure. After a short time, the compressor's clutch kicked on and the system pressure started to rise. It was hard to tell where the pressure stood as I was charging the system, and overcharging it would be a really bad move, so I periodically closed the manifold's low side valve so I could read them. Once the pressure got close to 30 psi on the low side and 180 psi on the high side, I permanently closed the low side valve. Here's the vent hose temp after charging the system. It's a nice chilly 37 degrees. Here's the center vent's air temp checked using a stem thermometer with the outside temp at about 75 degrees. As you can see, it's nice and cool. With this job basically finished, I turned off the truck and closed the refrigerant tank's valve so I could disconnect the AC lines. I used the screwdriver to once again purge the air from the yellow line at the manifold. Then I disconnected it from the manifold and the tank. Next, I removed the blue hose from the suction port on the back of the compressor and disconnected it from the manifold. This last part is why I stated in part 1 that I should have installed R134A quick disconnect adapters if there were enough room on the rear of the compressor. As I started to remove the red high pressure hose from the compressor, refrigerant began to spray. I immediately retightened the connector and put on a respirator, then proceeded to remove the hose. Alright, there you have it. There's fixing the high pressure AC hose on my truck. And the AC is nice and cold now. Actually, it's almost too cold at times. I found myself turning it down or turning it off fairly frequently because it does get pretty cold. So hopefully this information was helpful. And thanks for watching.